On today's Locked On Jayhawks, we're joined by Scott Chasen as we're going to go over some Big 12 basketball stuff, some KU basketball stuff, crossover questions, and we get on to Scott's worst coaching decisions of the week.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Eric Johnson, you can hear me as well on Rock Chalk Sports Talk from 3 to 6, Monday through Friday in Lawrence on KLWN. You can also hear Scott on Booth Review with Kansas City Sports Network. And thanks for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season, whether it's college football, college basketball, with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, Scott, hope everything's going today. Today's episode, we're going to go over some of the Big 12 basketball odds and take a look at the conference on that end of things. We got a bye week for KU football. I've got some more crossover questions between football and basketball, and then obviously your worst coaching decisions of the week. Let's start in the Big 12. BetOnline released their Big 12 preseason odds to win the conference. Baylor's sitting at 2-1. Kansas is at plus 210. Texas at plus 350, Texas Tech at 8-1, TCU at 9-1, and then another severe drop-off. Oklahoma State at 33-1, Iowa State at 50-1, same with West Virginia, and Kansas State is sitting at 100-1. What sticks out to you in the Big 12 preseason title odds?
Well, Derek, I think it's very apparent there are a few teams that are at the top of the conference, and those teams I would expect to be in contention. But I'll just say this about Kansas. I think Kansas will have a chance to win the Big 12. I actually think Kansas could be a very good team at the end of the season. But if you go back and listen to what Bill Self was talking about, just at Big 12 media, at Kansas basketball media day, if you track down the audio from that, Bill Self setting expectations low. And this team candidly reminds me of the team before the national championship team. Now, that was a good team that was playing really, really well at the end of the year, and people just remember the loss to USC. What they don't remember maybe is that half the team got COVID. David McCormick hurt his foot. That team was as good as any team in the country at the end of the year. And if you're a Kansas fan and you're hopeful for this year's team, that's what you're banking on. Because I'll tell you what, where Kansas starts the year preseason, and I want to make sure this doesn't get lost in context, where Kansas starts the year in preseason is not good enough to be second in the Big 12, is not a Final Four contender, is not a national championship contender. You're banking on that team improving because it is very talented. You're banking on Bill Self getting them to gel, and you're banking on that happening maybe before the start of Big 12 play. Kansas needs these first few months of development, and that's not abnormal. It happens to get to where at the end of the year they are in contention for a Big 12 title and they are for a Final Four. So I would stay away from those Kansas odds. In fact, you may be able to get better Kansas odds if Kansas slips up and loses a couple of games early. I like Baylor. I really like Texas. I think TCU under Texas Tech is a mistake, although TCU is still just kind of in need of that outside shooting, right? They need it to complement what they have. So, but I think it's right, and I think the fact that there's this top five that all have kind of similar in the realm of possibility odds, and then you get to Oklahoma and it just falls off a freaking cliff, I think that is very much where the Big 12 is this year. I think you got five really, really good teams. And then I think you got five teams that are going to try and figure it out. And I that's kind of where the split is in this conference.
Yeah, I think it's those top five. And then the bottom five, I think, are all just competing for basically 1 to 2 NCAA tournament spots, like as kind of a lower seed. And who knows, maybe Oklahoma State. I mean, they had the number 2 defense in the conference just behind Texas Tech last year. Their offense was kind of horrible, but also they didn't really have much motivation last year to play when you don't have the NCAA tournament. Like if Bryce Thompson, former Kansas transfer, steps up and the defense is still good with Musa Cisse down low, maybe they can be kind of a surprise team to what TCU was a season ago. But as far as, Big 12 title contenders, it's probably just those top five. I think what you said about Kansas is really interesting because I almost want to, if Kansas is ever plus money to win the Big 12, you almost just take it. They've won the league, I think, 20 out of 26 times since they've been in the Big 12. But I think what you said is accurate. You should probably, if you want to take Kansas, wait through the non-con, because what happens if they lose to Duke or they lose to Indiana or they lose some of these games that maybe you're not supposed to? You trip one up on the road in a game you're not supposed to in the non-con, and maybe their odds go down to 3-1 or plus 350, something like that, because there is going to be all that youth that they kind of have to overcome. So I think that's a good way of putting it. I do think that in the end, I wouldn't be surprised if like Baylor and Kansas shared the title, just like they did last season. I think Baylor is probably going to be the better team that maybe has the deeper run in March, but I wouldn't be shocked if Bill Self just finds a way to win the title, because that's just kind of what he does each and every year. If you had to pick someone between Texas Tech, and TCU outside of Baylor and Kansas, who would you go with?
I think I'd go with Texas, and that's betting on Chris Beard. It's betting on some returning talent. And I think it's a little different. I think Texas football's reputation sometimes gets passed to basketball, or like Shaka Smart's reputation sometimes gets passed to Chris Beard. I want to see what Chris Beard can do when he has his pieces, his program, his players, and he's building things his way. Also, sorry if you can hear that. There's like some lawn work going on outside, so I apologize if you can. But yeah, I want to see Texas. I think Texas would, outside of Baylor and Kansas, Texas would be my bet. And again, Derek, I know you get this, but just to make sure I'm explaining it again, like I do think at the end of the year, Kansas, if everything goes right, will have the chance to play for a Final Four. We'll have the chance to play for a Big 12 championship. We'll be that quality of team. But I'm just saying, where you start the season, when you look at the pieces that are on rosters now, especially the unproven pieces on Kansas, especially Bill Self saying, hey, when DeJuan's not in, Bobby Pettiford needs to run the show. Oh, by the way, he's had one healthy week basically this entire offseason. There are legitimate concerns. Bill Self was talking about Jankovic playing rotation minutes for this team. He was talking about him being the ninth man, and he said if you want to build a roster that can score, he has to be on the floor. That's in an early season alarm bell, like that shouldn't be tossed aside. This team is gonna actually have, a significant transition and need to make a lot of growth throughout the year. Bill Self was talking about they don't have a center who can score inside. These are a lot of Bill Self staples that Kansas will have to develop. And so I would expect this team, as much as any Bill Self team maybe ever, to improve a lot as the year goes on. I'd stay away from it right now. I would wait, because I do think they may trip up early, and then you can probably get better odds than at the end of the year they'll be playing their best basketball, because that's what Bill Self teams do and give them a better chance down the stretch.
Mm-hmm. Who would you say, just forget the title odd portion of this, who do you think is going to most overperform where they're maybe projected right now? Who do you think is going to most underperform? And for what it's worth, I agree with you on Texas. I think talent-wise, they have all sorts of talent. It's just, can Chris Beard figure it out?
Yeah, I think Oklahoma State, I think you're probably right there, would be my bet. I've been impressed by Mike Boynton a number of different seasons, a number of different ways, the buy-in he gets, the way he gets guys to click. And when it is working well, it seems like that team goes on runs that where they play above their head. And they have interesting pieces and guys. I mean, like, let's see if Bryce Thompson is ready to take another step and do something. I'm intrigued by them. Texas Tech, maybe I don't see it as much, but they'll be elite defensively, so I wouldn't pick them ever to underperform. Also because their fan base scares me a little bit. They get pretty vicious down there, but so maybe they're pegged pretty accurately. I would expect them to be top half, just with Mark Adams and that defense they play. I don't know if I see anyone that's necessarily too high in all of this. I think Iowa State, Kansas State, West Virginia, I would expect one of those teams to jump up a little bit, so that will knock someone down a little bit in the conference. But I'll tell you this, Derek, and this is not a knock on Kansas. Kansas just won a freaking national championship, okay? That's a great program. If Kansas finished first in the Big 12 this year, it would not surprise me. If Kansas finished fourth or fifth in the Big 12 this year, wouldn't surprise me. Anything in between there, 1 to 5, I think is legitimately in the range of possibilities. Now, I'm going to bet on Bill Self, and I'm going to bet on it being higher, so I'm not going to say Kansas will be the biggest underperformer. I'm just saying that range is in play to me, because I think the top half of the conference is very defined and very, very good. So one of those teams between Baylor, Kansas, Texas Tech, and TCU has got to finish in fifth. And I know Texas Tech and TCU are picked to finish 4 or 5, but any one of those 5 teams I could see, maybe other than Baylor, I could see that range being completely jumbled and just a mess. And so someone from that group is going to finish fifth, and that would be the one that disappoints.
And honestly, I think what realistically happens is there's 2 teams that maybe tie for first at like 14-4, and then there's maybe 2 or 3 teams that are tied at like 12-6. Like, it's just kind of a jumble. I think we saw that a couple years ago. I like the Oklahoma State one. They could be interesting. I think Texas Tech, you can make an argument for they could most overperform. Like, if the defense is that good and they have all these transfers, maybe they work ahead of TCU and Texas or something, or they could most underperform. Like, what if, Iowa State overperforms again and they have the Omarui kid from St. Bonaventure is such a good shot blocker. So certainly the conference is going to be very interesting all the way through here. In just a moment, we are going to switch over to a little KU football, KU basketball crossover talk here and ask Scott some questions. We've also got some worst coaching decisions of the week to come here. But first, this episode is brought to you by SweatBlock. And it's getting to that time of year. We're getting to the winter. We're getting to basketball season. You might be going into Allen Fieldhouse. Don't be the guy who is overdressed for Allen Fieldhouse and then you're sweating and then you have pit stains and you're raising your hands because they just had a big play and the person next to you is like, oh no, that smells, that stinks. Like, no, get rid of the pit stains, get rid of the odor, and you can do that with SweatBlock. It gives you the confidence to wear what you want without embarrassing underarm sweat. The SweatBlock wipes were featured and tested on the Rachel Ray Show by firefighters. If you or someone is experiencing embarrassing sweat or odor, try SweatBlock. Save 20% with promo code LOCKEDON at sweatblock.com, also available on Amazon. So I've got some crossover questions for you here, Scott. And again, between KU football and KU men's basketball, which would be more concerning? Now, for this one for football, we literally just saw this happen. KU being down 25 at half in Waco, or would it be Kansas losing by 25 both games to Waco or to Baylor?
Well, I think the second one would be more concerning, especially because how the first one happened, I think, made a lot of sense to me. A lot of talk about the defense, which has been very up and down this year. But outside of the Oklahoma game, the defense has done what the defense is. It's forced teams to drive the length of the field. It's largely limited explosives. And I put out this stat late in the game against Baylor that Kansas got stops on 5 of the first 7 Baylor drives that began in Baylor territory. So that tells me the defense was having a 71% success rate of getting stops. That's exceptional. That's all you could ever ask from them. Kansas's defense gave up, sorry, I had to cough. Kansas's defense gave up 21 points to Baylor on drives that started in Baylor territory. That's success. That's fine. Why Baylor scored those points is because Kansas twice fumbled on the first play of a drive. Kansas went 3-and-out 3 times in the first half. And when Kansas's defense got its first takeaway, Kansas went 3-and-out and punted the ball right back. So to me, that was less alarm bells, and that was more clean up some little things. Don't fumble on the first play of a drive. Get your offense going a little bit earlier. If Kansas basketball is getting blown out by Baylor a couple times in Big 12 play, I think that would be alarming because it won't be like the Kentucky game last year, where Kansas lost by a bunch. But what did Bill Self say at Media Day? He said people don't understand the intangibles that were with that team last year. Last year's KU team, take nothing away from them, was not a top 5 Bill Self team. Not in the vicinity, Derek, of being a top 5 Bill Self team. But they thought they were. They thought they were really good. They had Remy Martin, who could make any shot anytime. They had Ochai Agbaji, who was going to be an NBA lottery pick. They had Christian Brown, who would, I had to make sure I say this right, mother F every single person in an arena and not care about getting technical fouls after he dunks in your face. They had David McCormick, who was so up and down and tumultuous and the fan base, whatever, that at the end of the year, he didn't even care. He missed the hook shot. He got his rebound. He went at Brady Manick and Armando Bacot and put that thing back. That ball was going to David McCormick. And then he did it again. Okay. They had dudes who didn't care. They got the right matchups. And that's what matters. You don't get to complain about having a hard path and then say, well, they got an easy path. No, that's the tournament. Sometimes you get an easier pass. Sometimes you get a hard pass. They got among the easier paths for a champion that you could possibly have. But they won all their games. They were a 1 seed. That's why they earned that path. So I think the difference between that team and this team, and Bill Self was calling that out by pointing out the intangibles, you got more young guys. You got more guys who haven't been in those situations. So I don't know how they would necessarily respond to some of those bigger losses. I think those would be bigger setbacks, especially later in the year. So I would just say less concerning football because they got back in the game. It was little dumb stuff that the offense was doing. That was pretty much it. Once they cleaned that up, they played complementary football and they looked great. Basketball would be bigger alarm bells.
Yes, that would. If you lost twice by 25 to them, that would not work out. But the one thing basketball has that football doesn't is a giant tournament where weird things can happen and not make sense of the regular season at times.
Yeah.
Which is more likely? KU football center Mike Nowitzki being all Big 12 first or second team, or
That
any
whatever
KU
you're
basketball.
gonna say. I don't need to hear the rest of this, Derek. I'm gonna jump on this.
Okay.
KU basketball center position is a mess right now.
I was going to
They
say
gotta
any
figure it
KU
out.
basketball center getting even all Big 12 honorable mention.
I stand by my answer. They've got to figure that out. Bill Self said today, or said the other day, that there is no separation. That's not good. Bill Self wants
He said
separation.
1A, 1B, 1C, and 1D.
And maybe there is a little bit of separation, but he's saying that to make a point to those guys. Jalen Wilson is going to play some 5 for this team. KJ Adams is going to play some 5 for this team. Bill Self pointed out, hey, Zach Clements is a perimeter guy. He's got to score inside. And oh, by the way, can he defend Oscar Tshiebwe? Can he defend? I can't remember the examples he gave, but he gave a couple examples of centers. Can he
said
defend those
Trace
guys?
Jackson Davis, which to be fair, though, who is, but you get the
Very
sense.
fair, but that's his point. Can you score inside? Can you defend those guys, or are you just a situational piece? And whether or not he believes that, and whether or not Zach Clements is actually farther along or further along than Bill Self is admitting at this point, and maybe it's not quite all so even, he's trying to motivate them. Those are Bill Self alarm bells. Those are Bill Self trying to make a point to guys that they need to play better. I'm not sold on the 5-spot short term. Now, long term, I am, because I think you have talent there. I think you have really exciting freshmen. I think Zach Clements gives you options. KJ Adams, Jalen Wilson at the 5. They will figure it out throughout the course of the season. But I'm going to bet that start to finish, they're not going to have an all Big 12 kind of guy. Maybe honorable mention there, but that's a weakness that needs to be addressed. David McCormick wasn't perfect, but he was David McCormick, and he was good enough to win you a number of games throughout, really the last 2 seasons of his career. It's his limitations were not his fault beyond they didn't have anyone better. So they had to put him in those situations. This year, I expect a lot of tinkering. Now, I will say, if Zach Clements turns out to be that dude, and he is that dude, that immeasurably will raise Kansas's ceiling. So I would circle that position right now to say major concern, but let's see what happens. Yeah, but I wouldn't bet on all Big 12 there.
I like this one a lot. More players drafted for their respected 2023 drafts. KU football plus 1.5 or KU basketball. So with football, I don't know, Jalen could come back. Maybe he gets draft eligible. I think Mason Fairchild, I really do think he could be like a day 3 pick. Earl Bostic, Mike Nowitzki, Dominic Pooney, like any of them could be like a late round pick. Lonnie Phelps, if he decides to go, maybe pick. Kenny Logan, getting plus 1.5. What do you think?
Okay. So plus one, whatever, hold on. Plus 1.5, KU football is plus 1.5. That's
Yes.
what the math is. Okay, well, then I think KU football, because I think they're going to have one player drafted at least, right? You would assume one guy will go in the draft, although maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And just then, Kansas basketball would have to have 3 players drafted when, like, Jalen Wilson probably, Kevin McCullough maybe.
I think
Grady Dick,
McCullough has a
maybe.
better chance than Wilson, to be honest, just because he's a wing. I guess Jalen's a wing too, but you know what I mean? Like Kevin McCullough's more of the traditional 3-and-D wing.
Yeah, I kind of just talked myself into the basketball side of things too, because most of these KU guys can come back. I actually did this on Booth Review. If you look at the number of KU players who are draft eligible, you're basically losing your defensive line. You're losing like 4 guys from there, and then you lose Earl Bostic, and that's it. Every other player on this roster is eligible to return.
I mean, even Phelps can come back. Like he could go pro. He could come back too.
Yeah, and I would expect most of these guys to come back. I'll still lean KU football because all it takes is 1 or 2, and then you're asking for a crazy number from the basketball team. But that's only if we're talking for one draft. If we're talking for future drafts, I think this KU basketball team is going to end up having a lot of draft picks, because I think these big men could all turn into draft picks at some point. Obviously, what you have on the wing, backcourt, every position, you have basically loaded up with guys who could turn into picks. Candidly, it wouldn't shock me if DeJuan Harris down the line turned into a draft pick, just because he's long, he's got that length, defensively good passing instincts. If he can get that shot to be a little bit more reliable, it doesn't have to be prolific. And then MJ Rice, Grady Dick, you have a roster full of talent. But for specifically the 2023 draft, I'll bet on football. But long term, even though the basketball roster is like a 10th of the size, I think a lot of those guys are going to get drafted.
Okay, last one. More beloved player by their respected coach. DeJuan Harris by Bill Self or Jason Bean by Lance Leipold?
DeJuan Harris. And that's not anything against Jason Bean, but Bill Self loves DeJuan Harris, just like he loved Marcus Garrett, like he learned to love Landon Lucas. It's those type of guys who just kind of start to understand him, get along with him, stick around with him, and then run the team. In the way they allow Bill Self to do the things that he wants to do. Not to just keep going back to his most recent press conference, but he made a point about last year's team and they could put in 5 new sets and start running them. And he said this year it's going to be meat and potatoes for a long time. He's not saying that just to say that. He's not saying it to put down his team, but he's saying this is a new team. This is new pieces. These are new guys. They're going to have to come along slowly. He even said it may look like they're not coaching them as much because they're going to have to learn so much more. So again, the floor for Kansas is always super high because Bill Self's an amazing coach. The talent is on the roster, and you bring back Jalen Wilson, DeJuan Harris, and you have Kevin McCullough. That's a great stopgap. Great, Grady Dickstreet, pretty good. Zach Clements, you would think there are pieces, okay, but it's going to take a little bit of time. So I think Bill Self likes having that security blanket with DeJuan Harris. Derek, I have a crossover question for you, if that's allowed.
Let's do it.
What is your favorite crossover you've ever seen? Because I have a very specific one and a funny story that goes with it.
Man, there's all sorts of crossovers. It could be a TV episode crossover. It could be a basketball crossover, like Allen Iverson just crossing someone over. It could be a crossover of condiments. Like, how they have the peanut butter and jelly in one squeeze bottle. You've never seen those?
No, that it actually couldn't be that, but I'm glad you, I'll give you mine while you think.
Okay.
Summer League, Dante Exum, Australian point guard, 6'5", his rookie year. I think he was Australian. I sure hope so. Otherwise, maybe just played there. He had a really sick right to left crossover, embarrassed the guy, got to the bucket. And I was like, that dude is going to be an NBA All-Star 10 times over. And if you've never watched the NBA, he turned out to be the best player in the NBA for years and years and years. Do you have a favorite crossover, Derek?
Dante Exum was a 2K legend because he was just a super athletic point guard that worked really well. Honestly, can we go back to a Michael Jordan crossover, the one against the Jazz where he probably pushed off for an offensive foul, but if you're going to get away from it or get away with it, which you always are because you're Michael Jordan, then 100% success rate.
Yeah, vote in the comments here who had a better crossover, Dante Exum at Summer League or Michael Jordan in Game 6 of pivotal NBA Finals. Both very significant. And again, if you never watched the NBA, if you did watch the NBA, I'm not talking to you. If you've never watched the NBA, Dante Exum, multiple-time MVP, 5-time Defensive Player of the Year. I mean, he just turned into he led the Jazz to several championships. Just incredible.
That's what everybody says. Exum versus MJ. So I'm glad we got the 2 greatest players of all time. Okay. Worst coaching decisions of the week. Who are the
We got a graphic. We got a graphic, Derek. I love it. All right. So I have 3 candidate-ishes. And I'll explain that. It's an interesting group. So number 1 is Darvin Ham, the Lakers head coach. He tried to kill Russell Westbrook by bringing him off the bench. At least that's how I interpreted Russell Westbrook's comments. No, the Lakers are a mess. They brought Russ off the bench. And he got banged up somehow. And then after the game, he's like, well, I've never come off the bench before, so I don't know how to stretch for that. And then they had him on the game late in crunch time, and he took an awful 2-for-1 shot when there were 17 seconds on the shot clock, and his team was winning by 1, and they ended up losing that game. And both Anthony Davis and LeBron, who were on the court, are visibly why are you shooting that? But I don't blame Russell Westbrook. Russell Westbrook is Russell Westbrook. When you trade for him, when you sign him, you know who he is. They've put him in the worst possible positions. He has no floor spacing. He doesn't have the talent that would make him work. And they put him in bad spots on the floor. So that's on coaching Darvin Ham. Number 2, Kevin Stefanski of the Browns. Derek, I don't know if you saw this. I think this was the worst challenge in NFL history. So I'm going to set the situation for you, okay? You're the head coach. Ready? It was 3rd and 17. Lamar Jackson is the quarterback you're going against. He picks up 7 yards. You thought he might have got sacked, but he escapes. He got 7 yards. It's 4th and 10, and they're lining up to punt. What do?
I mean, you just let it go. They're lining up to punt.
Nope. You throw that challenge flag to try and get 7 yards of field position. You lose your challenge. You lose your timeout. It was the first half of the game. And oh, by the way, the first punt went 40 yards. That was the punt they blew dead because he challenged it for some reason when the other team was punting him the ball back. The second punt went 69 yards. So they ended up losing 20 yards of field position because he challenged the spot on 4th and 10 when he was getting the ball back, Derek. I think it's the worst challenge of all time. Isn't that pretty shocking?
That's really bad. Yeah, the only time you would do that is like, did the sack lead to a safety or did it lead to like a forced fumble? You thought that is inexcusable.
Okay, and then the last one is every single coach in the NFL approaching the 2-minute warning. And I want to explain this really quickly because I was watching this with Matt Galloway, former friend of your other show, and my head was exploding. So if there's 2 minutes and 25 seconds left, the other team has a second down. You have one timeout left, okay? They run the ball. 5 seconds go off the clock. Now it's 2:20. You've got two options. It's third down now. I can call my timeout at 2:20, or I can let it go to 2 minutes and then call my timeout on the next play. Derek, I call my timeout at 2:20. And the reason why I do is one, it guarantees they're going to run to get to the 2-minute warning on third down. And then when that third down play is over, how much time is going to be on the clock? 2 minutes, because that's when the clock stops. Okay? If I don't, the clock runs down to 2 minutes. Their next play goes down to 1 minute and 53 seconds or whatever. And I've lost 7 seconds when there are 2 minutes left in a football game. And Derek, 7 seconds is not a lot of time, but it could be a play. It could be a field goal. It could be something. It could be enough time to spike the ball. And it makes my head explode when I see a coach be like, well, we'll just let it go to 2 minutes. It's like, no, call the timeout, make them run again, save 5, 6, 7, 8, sometimes seconds. And that can make the entire difference at the end of a game. I saw like 4 different coaches screw that up this week. Not all. A couple got it right. It makes my head explode. So anyway, those are the
what
three
I'm waiting for?
Yeah.
Because that is right. Like every coach does that wrong. But I'm waiting for a coach to take it to the next level to be like, hey, if I take a timeout with exactly like 2 minutes and 48 seconds or something like that in a certain scenario, they're going to have to run a play. Then it's going to make them run one more play before the 2-minute warning. You know what I mean? Like if they only have one timeout left, like call it with 2:48 as opposed to with whatever the other scenario. But I don't know. I think there's some stuff there. So who is the winner this week? I feel like it has to be the third one because there's a mass volume of it. Who is the winner?
I'm going to go with Kevin Stefanski.
Okay,
I think that's the worst
too.
challenge in the history of the NFL without having done any research on what actually is the worst challenge in the history of the NFL. Challenging to get 7 yards of field position when you are getting the ball back on a punt and then costing your teams 20 yards is insane. Derek, absolutely insane. By the way, the other thing that annoys me, and I should have lumped this in, is when coaches don't use their last timeout and they just let the other team take 40 seconds off. And then the announcer, usually someone whose name rhymes with Groy Grakeman, will say something like, well, that's good. They need that last timeout to make sure they can set up the field goal. Derek, you know how long it takes to set up a field goal? Not 40 seconds. So by definition, 40 seconds is more valuable than your one timeout. And that drives me crazy too every time. So yeah, lots of work to do. But Kevin Stefanski, welcome to the list. That was not a great challenge decision, and they lost by 3.
All right, that's Scott's worst coaching decisions of the week. He is Scott Chasen. You can check him out on Booth Review with Kansas City Sports Network as well. Scott, appreciate the time, man. See you next week.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that was Scott Chasen joining us here for Locked On Jayhawks, and that's going to do it for today's edition of the show. Coming up on tomorrow, we're going to be joined by Jason Jordan of Sports Illustrated with the basketball recruiting side of things to take a look at the class of 2023 for KU basketball. If you have anything you'd like for the show to talk about, you can reach out at D Johnson Radio on Twitter. Don't forget to subscribe to the show so you're getting all the latest with Locked On Jayhawks. That'll do it for today's episode. Have a good rest of your day. I'll see some of you on Rock Chalk Sports Talk later today. Till then, later.